Tonight we are in Oban, seafood capital of Scotland and gateway to the Western Isles. It's an idyllic spot, whatever the weather, but it also has its challenges: transport, housing and health. So what are the big issues for people who live here? Let's find out. Welcome to Debate Night. Between now and the general election, Debate Night will be travelling Scotland, giving voters the chance to scrutinise the politicians, the policies and the promises as well. Tonight we're in Oban on our panel this evening. The Deputy Leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Meghan Gallacher, MSP for Central Scotland. Meghan joined the Scottish Conservatives at 21 and was elected to Holyrood 3 years ago. From Scottish Labour, former MP Michael Shanks. Of course, no MPs, all candidates at the moment in the general election. Michael was elected, though, as an MP just last year and became a shadow Scotland Office Minister and joined the Scottish Affairs Committee. He hopes to be returned to Westminster at the forthcoming election. From the SNP, former MP and party spokesperson for Europe and EU accession, Alyn Smith. Alyn spent 15 years as an MEP for Scotland before being elected to Westminster. He's also standing again in this election. Also with us, former leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Willie Rennie, MSP for North East Fife. Willie's also the party spokesperson for economy, education and communities. And finally, adventurer and entrepreneur Guy Grieve. Guy spent a year living in the Alaskan wilderness before returning to Mull, where he ran the Ethical Shellfish Company. His new business, Atlantic Garden, grows seaweed to help gardening become more sustainable. Please welcome them all to Debate Night. And of course, welcome to our studio audience here in Oban. Our first time with you. It's great to be in this area this evening. And you can join in the discussion from home, wherever you are in Scotland. BBC DN is the hashtag you need right now, or on social media, where the debate has started. And our podcast of the show will be available for you to download straight after this broadcast. So we are, what, a month? 2 weeks into the election campaign, a month still to go. All of a sudden, debates are in fashion and popular. We've set a high bar here in Debate Night, but we've had 2 election debates already this week. I'll tell you about our special programme next week a little bit later. But what have we learned from the TV debates so far this week? Alyn Smith.
Well, the big thing for me, I have to say, from the Prime Minister Sunak and Keir Starmer debate was that Scotland wasn't mentioned once. And I want to see politicians focus on what Scotland needs. Now, the SNP has a vision for Scotland and Europe. That's transformative. That's the change I think we need to see. I think Mr Sunak had a very bad night, I have to say, and I think Starmer did do better. But what's going to happen in the Westminster election is that this election is going to be decided in England. And what we need to see is a strong voice for Scotland within that context going forward. And I'd like to work with the Labour Party on things that need to be changed, that need to be transformed. I want to see the back of this Tory government, but I think there are things that we need to do much more radically than Labour is actually proposing. And Labour's commitment to a continued austerity agenda, we saw that loud and clear last night, that even the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that Labour is committed to £18 billion worth of cuts. I want to see us choose something different. So the debates actually served a useful purpose, I think, last night.
You've had your 45 seconds. So, Shanks, you were shaking your head there. What did you learn from last night and the night before as well?
Well, I think in the debates what we saw very clearly was that there's only really one option on the ballot paper that delivers change, and that's Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, because what we saw in really every answer last night from Rishi Sunak was a series of excuses about why things haven't gone well for the last 14 years, wanting to kind of divert onto his vision of the future, but take absolutely no responsibility for the chaos that we've been in. I mean, we're all, every one of us, still living through the chaos of the Liz Truss budget, living through the chaos of economic incompetence in the past 14 years.
Was it a good night for Keir Starmer last night, Michael?
I think it was a very good night for Keir Starmer last night, partly because what you saw was his vision for the country, but also I think what you saw was a leader who has a bit of empathy. There was a question from someone called Paula at the beginning that stuck with me, who was asking about the cost of living crisis and was talking about how she struggled to make ends meet every single month. And Rishi Sunak just started talking about how great their plans are for the economy, totally tone deaf to the reality that we're all living through. Whereas Keir Starmer outlined the change that you'll get with Labour, whether that's through the New Deal for working people that will lift people out of poverty, or whether that's through returning the country to some stable economic basis so we can actually get economic growth back into our economy that benefits us all. That's the choice that's on the ballot paper. And I'm glad to hear Alyn wants to work with an incoming Labour government, but ultimately, on the 4th of July, we've got a choice between a Labour Prime Minister or a Conservative Prime Minister, and waking up on the 5th of July to 5 more years of the chaos and incompetence we've been through is the last thing any of us want.
I'll come to the audience in just a few moments, see what you thought of what you saw over the last couple of nights. Meghan, Gallacher, what did you learn from last night and the night before as well?
Well, Scotland, that's a good point, because Scotland was treated to not just one debate, but 2 leaders' debates. I thought Rishi Sunak performed well. That was echoed in the polls following the debate last night. But actually, I do need to give a shout out to Douglas Ross, because he performed exceptionally well in the leaders' debate on Monday evening. I thought the message was clear in terms of the context here in Scotland, where it will be the case that in many seats right up and down the country, it will be a straight fight between the Scottish Conservatives and the SNP. We've seen SNP incompetence here in Scotland for the last 17 years, and certainly when I'm out speaking to voters on the doors, that's what they're telling me. They're telling me about NHS waiting times that's devolved to Scotland. They're telling me about the school standards that are slipping. Again, that's devolved to Scotland.
Yeah, and this is a general election. It's not a Holyrood election.
Yes, but these are the real issues that are facing Scotland, and this is because of SNP incompetence here in Scotland. These are the issues that really matter to people, and of course they will be relevant in the general election.
Well, let's fact-check that, what really matters to people here. Gentleman with the glasses, yeah, what have you learned from these first 2 debates?
Yeah. The elephant in the room is, in fact, Brexit, and yet none of the leaders are actually talking about Brexit. Now, the West Coast, here, in fact, in Oban, especially in Argyll, in fact, was very much yes. We didn't want, in fact, to actually leave Europe. So, to all intents and purposes, why is it that the politicians have actually forgotten about Brexit?
That's a very good question for Willie Rennie from the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Why have you forgotten about Brexit?
We've not forgotten about Brexit, because what we need to do is to focus on a pragmatic way to get back closer to Europe. Because I think what people...
Not back into Europe.
Well, I think what people were fed up with was years of argument about Brexit. It took over the political system of this country. Almost nothing else was capable of being done. And what we need now is, say, for instance, if you're a joiner from Auchtermuchty in my constituency, I want that joiner to be able to work anywhere in Europe with a mutual agreement about trades and professions. I want to make sure that the university in St Andrews, which is my constituency, are able to participate fully in the Horizon scheme and the Erasmus scheme, so that students can travel right across Europe. We can reach agreements on those individual things.
But there's no way back into the EU via the Liberal Democrats, is what you're saying.
But if you want to have this big battle again over Brexit, you can do. I don't think it's going to take us any further. But what we can do, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, where people are under incredible pressure on housing, in energy costs, we need to make sure that we make life easier for people today. I don't want to have a multi-year argument about that, just like we are on independence. I want to focus on making life better for people. But it's my turn, I think, to pay great tribute to my leader, who participated in the debate on Monday, because that's what you're supposed to do on these occasions. I happen to think that Alex was very clear in the debate on Monday, and on Tuesday you'll have seen the interview with Ed Davey afterwards, who I thought talked very movingly about caring, about making sure that, for instance, the issues around his son, which affect many, many people across the country, are at the centre of this general election, that we deal with the sewage in our rivers, that we make sure that we reform our social care system. All of those things should be the heart of this election campaign. I don't actually think the debate last night changed an awful lot, because I think Michael's right, I think change is coming in the country, in many seats across the country, in Scotland and the rest of the UK. It's a straight choice, with the Liberal Democrats involved, and that's why we need to focus on getting that change in every corner of the country. Because I think, to be honest, people are sick, fed up of the division and the arguments that have bedevilled this country with both the SNP and the Conservatives.
OK, these debates are designed to help you make your mind up and appeal to you. So let's see what you've learned and what's maybe changed for you. Gentleman in the cap there.
So you talk about continuation, you talk about change, you talk about what people are fed up with. However, what we've seen in the debates is that no matter who we vote for, Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak or the SNP or the Lib Dems, we're going to get exactly the same as what we've had for the last 14 years. Mm-hmm. We've had 14 years of Conservative government. Nothing's changed. Keir Starmer came up to Scotland in a private jet, he talked about Great British Energy, which was meant to be a company, but is actually an investment vehicle for public funds to go to private investment. Rishi Sunak flew in a chopper after lording about railway, and it cost him £2,500. I mean, these are not politicians that speak for the people. These are not politicians that speak for people like us in Argyll and Bute. Argyll and Bute generates a massive whack of the UK, well, Scotland and the UK's renewable energy. We export £4 billion every year from Scotland in renewable energy. That $4 billion could power Scottish homes 2 times over, yet 39% of people in Scotland suffer from fuel poverty.
Okay.
What is going to be done about that?
Okay, thank you. And man in the grey shirt down here as well. Yeah.
My opinion about Brexit has changed in that I agree with Willie Rennie, and I think that we shouldn't be looking to go back into the EU. We should be trying to investigate all the possible groups and things that we can join. My concern about the SNP flagship policy is because they're pushing green ports, that is excluding our opportunity to go back into the EU.
No. Guy Grieve, you watched the debates.
Yeah.
What did you take away from them?
You know, I really get just such a whiff of party strategies going on. These guys believe that they know Brexit was a disaster. We're 140 billion down, 5% down on our GDP. We're 330,000 workers short. The list goes on and on for the disasters that Brexit's done to us. You're absolutely right there. That's the elephant in the room. It's literally taken our life rafts on this boat and torn them up because it's stolen people's dreams. You know, I've worked with people who are just, you know, at sea, who've been working away, putting money aside because one day they're going to find their little corner in the sun in Europe after 30, 40, 50 years of work. That's gone. That's stolen. You know, people who can't afford to change their lives, etc. And what essentially I'm thinking here, and it's coming around again, and you so brilliantly pointed it out, is this ship is being guided by people who are entirely insulated by personal wealth. It does not matter. I heard Kwasi Kwarteng speaking on the rest is politics, for example. It was all just a big laugh. Boris Johnson, you know, they have taken our country into such a dire place. And for them, it's just an anecdote at a dinner party somewhere in the home counties. And they're going to laugh about it. You know, and I really feel that they are not dealing with this big problem because of party politics, because of party strategies. They got us into Brexit because of party strategies, because Cameron thought, let's take the wind out of UKIP's sails and call their bluff, and they're going to lose this referendum. They didn't lose the referendum. He gambled with our country and absolutely screwed us up as a result. And I just feel these people know it's wrong. Why don't they just say, we got it wrong. It was wrong. I'm sure we're not going to change it now. But that's what I believe in. And that's what I'm going to do. It's not going to happen straight away. And trust us all to be adults to understand that that's the case. Haven't seen that. So all I saw was 2 well-insulated actors just taking us on to another round.
So picking up on that, and that man's point there, Michael Shanks, I mean, your whole slogan in this election is change. He doesn't believe anything is going to change in his life as a result of what Conservative and Labour are offering.
Yeah, and look, that's a common view in the country because we've gone through so much recently of people thinking nothing works in this country. Our public services just don't work. We're paying more in tax. We're getting nothing back out. We've got relatives, we're maybe ourselves on an NHS waiting list for months, years at a time. So it's not surprising that people think government can't change things. But the idea that what we're proposing to do and the chaos of the last 14 years are in anywhere near the same thing, I think is ridiculous. And some of the details, so I think you raised a number of points about GB Energy. That's our radical plan, partly to move us towards the renewable future that we need to be in, but to have the public, the taxpayer, all of us have a stake in that renewable future. Because what's happened at the moment is the SNP and the Conservatives have invested in renewables. We have a lot of renewables already, but the profits of that aren't coming back to us in Scotland. They're going to foreign companies, foreign countries even. The Conservatives are in favour of nationalisation, but only nationalisation of other countries. France and Sweden own a huge amount of our renewable infrastructure, but not the British taxpayers. And what we are saying is that partly to bring energy bills down for everybody, to remove the idea that Putin can put his boot on our throat whenever there's a problem and energy bills spike and we all pay the price, to create tens of thousands of jobs in the renewable future that we know we need to have.
And you said it would be
for the
headquartered
British
here in
taxpayer,
Scotland. Will we find out in the manifesto where?
I don't know, is the honest answer. And look, I don't think the location of it is actually absolutely vital to the change that it can deliver.
It better be Oban. It better be Oban.
It will be somewhere in Scotland.
OK, all right, OK. We're in Oban tonight. Next Tuesday, we're going to be in Glasgow for a debate night Scotland Leaders special, live on BBC One at 8 o'clock. If you'd like to be with us in the room and ask the questions on the night, just go to the address that's on your screen right now. Let's go to our first question of the night tonight, which comes from Susan Simpson. Susan, evening.
Hi. How do the panel intend to address the urgent housing emergency and the lack of available housing to meet demand?
Thank you, Susan. Argyll and Bute, the first local authority in Scotland to declare a housing emergency. Guy Grieve, you've had experience of this, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, we all know the market forces are cruel. And that's fine. There's a bit of science to that. But when they get hold of our rights to have homes, then it gets tricky. So when our dive fishing business on Mull, we were diving out of there for 12 years. You know, the hardest thing was, it wasn't hard finding people to do the job, although it was a difficult and painful job, but it was hard finding places for people to stay. We all know it. You know, I was renting a place on Mull, and it was quite a spooky place to be, that I knew that the laird from whom I rented from would get more in a week than I would pay for a month of my rent. It's quite a difficult place for tenants to be. I was in a little settlement where there were only 2 permanent residents there. The rest was, you know, holiday homes and such. So anyway, you know, the only thing that can control a market is government. And we need government, and I know the SNP have certainly been active on this. We need government to grapple with the market and to put down laws and regulations which can control it. So, for example, estates should be told that have housing stock, 60% of that has to be long-term rental. 40% do your holiday rentals. You have to impose restraints on the market, otherwise it runs rampant, and we've all seen that we've got a housing famine here.
Yeah, I think 3,000, more than 3,000 second homes in this area. Susan, you asked the question, what's been your experience of this?
Well, so I'm from Dunbeg, just outside Oban. I was born there, raised there, went to school here, moved away to Inverness and decided to bring my family back to Argyll. But we could only get private rental at the time that we came back. The 2 private rentals we've had here were both damp. They were very hard to heat. We would sit with duvets on our knees to keep warm at night because we could only heat 1 room. And then we were made homeless because our first landlord had to sell up for very legitimate reasons. But we left that home on the last day, the day before the last day of term. I work in a school. We emptied the house that night, and I went to work the next day, homeless, and with 2 children, homeless. And we spent 6 weeks living in friends' holiday cottages. We went on holiday so that we could be away. We went to a caravan to stay. And then eventually we managed to find another private rental, also very damp, also very hard to heat.
And what's the situation now?
Thankfully now, we were made homeless from that one. Thankfully now, because of the development at Dunbeg for social housing, we finally made it far enough up the list to be afforded a social house. So we're safe now. And we know that that can never be taken from us.
Thank you. Michael Shanks, in Scotland in 2024, it's not much to ask, really, is it?
No, I think that's a really sad and shocking story. But it'd be even more shocking it's not unique. And one of the things I've been most surprised about since I became an MP is the sheer amount of casework I've got that's about housing. And it's about families being made homeless, which is extraordinary. I just didn't expect there to be that amount of it.
But the issues are very different somewhere like here compared to Edinburgh or Glasgow.
They are to a certain extent. I mean, the fundamental issue is we don't have enough supply. And that is the fundamental problem everywhere, regardless of where we are in Scotland. We're not building enough homes. And we need to grasp that.
Who should be building those homes, Michael?
Well, it's a partnership. I think there is a role for local authorities through funding from central government. That is important, particularly in terms of social housing. Housing associations, the kind of part ownership model is important as well. But it is also about recognising private investment in housing developments, a key part of it as well, particularly for people buying their own homes. I think we need to look at a couple of different things. Firstly, the housing budget from central government was slashed in the budget this year in Scotland. Some of it was restored in the dying days of Humza Yousaf's time as First Minister, but there was still a huge cut to that budget. That will have a huge impact, but local authorities also have a really key role, particularly in temporary accommodation, and they've had their budgets cut year after year as well. So there's that, and then I think there is an issue around the planning system as well. We've said in our manifesto we'll have some really clear commitments around simplifying the planning system.
What do you mean simplifying? Loosening it up? Green belt?
So in some cases, we're talking specifically about the grey belt, because actually there's a lot of green belt that on paper is green belt, but when you actually look at it, it's not at all. I mean, there's a famous case in London of a series of petrol stations that are on green belt. They're not green belt in any rational sense of what that means. So we need to free up some land, and there's a balance, of course. We're not saying we should build over everything. But ultimately, the only way out of this is for us to build a lot more.
Homes are all about people, so let's hear from some people. Man in the front row.
I think the difficulty here, I don't know that building is the answer in this area, as much as we can. Oban's limited in terms of area around us, and we're also limited in infrastructure. So that an easy panacea to the problem there is build more. I think the controls have to be in terms of rent, but specifically for me, on holiday homes, and if we're allowed to name it, Airbnb. Because affordable housing, which appears here, is immediately snapped up for Airbnb. We're surrounded by them where I live in town. And a lot of us in the town here will have adult kids who can't afford to live in their own town. They're either living with us or they're living away.
OK, let me just hear from the lady in the striped top there. Yes, on you go.
And we're also not getting support for alternative types of living, like co-housing, which is virtually impossible to get started up here in Scotland. There's been lots of co-housing projects down in England, but those are small scale, they're sustainable, and there's also the whole concept of having tiny homes and tiny home communities. It doesn't have to be big homes built by developers. And people want to build their own homes, but on a smaller scale. And there's no support for that.
Guy Grieve?
When you say Airbnb, the first thing I think is, isn't it an absolute disgrace that a private company can completely alter the sociological makeup of our country? I mean, that's just got to be crazy. And to me, that's another call for government.
More regulation.
More regulation. Got to be taken on.
Meghan Gallacher.
Well, to go back to the point, before I was an MSP, I was a councillor. And similar to Michael, and still to this day, there is not a week goes by without having a housing concern of some kind. And it should never, ever be the case that you're living in a homeless situation. We have too many people actually on temporary and homeless waiting lists right up and down the country. And there is another solution to building, and that's looking at the empty properties that we do have in this country. And that is something that can be done through the Scottish Government if the SNP were to seriously look at this issue, get those houses up to a standard and be able to bring them back into social housing in order for people to be able to go into those housing. That is a serious issue we've got right up and down the length and breadth of this country, but that is seriously an issue for the Scottish Government, and despite politicians of all different parties raising it, it just has not been the focus of the SNP, I'm afraid.
Gentleman with the glasses.
First, to come back to Meghan, you talked about bringing the homes up to standard, but the Conservative government have trashed and allowed building standards, to be trashed over and over and over again, which led to things like Grenfell Nobody was ever arrested for that. And also, why are we ignoring the elephant in the room? That there are huge swathes of land in this country that are owned by a tiny number of people, but we can't get access to it because their relatives way back looked after the land for members of the royal family, and now that's kept. There's plenty of land in this country that's just not accessible because it's being hoarded by a small number of people.
Alyn Smith?
The gentleman's just made my point for me. Land reform is a job not yet finished in Scotland. And access to land, access to property is at the root of all of this. Now, very struck as well by the point about second homes. The bit of the world I know best, it's almost impossible to get a house because they're being snapped up for Airbnb.
So Guy Grieve says regulate this.
Yes.
This is a role for government.
Well, we've started. We've started with now you'll be paying on a second home double the council tax. I think that's a start. We need to be changing the taxation system to actually disincentivise that as an economic model. I think homes are for living in, not as a commercial business to make money out of. So we need to see much more regulation on the rented sector. We need more houses, and I'd agree with Michael that we do need to look at planning seriously to incentivise the building of houses.
But what about
access to land? I agree with you as well, actually. Empty properties and bad landlords who are allowing empty properties to go to rack and ruin.
I'm talking about the ones that...
But they're the first ones that actually go to law. So we need to change the law on empty properties, absentee landlords, and Airbnb as well. Airbnb, when it was started, remember, and this is how, again, technological change is moving so much, it was the spare room app. It wasn't supposed to be your whole house. And houses have to be for living in, because I'm seeing communities I represent where locals can't get a look in when a house comes on the market, and that's few and far between. It's gone in days. The housing market is broken, and we need much more muscular government intervention to change it.
Lady with the glasses, your hand up. Yes.
I think we've talked about the idea of bringing empty houses back into use and renovating those houses. The lady who asked the question originally talked about the quality of the houses, them being cold and damp. There is an issue about that quality of housing stock, which is not just to do with the stock itself, but it's to do with having the capacity, the contractors, the ability for people to get those renovations done. Certainly locally, I think most people would agree, getting any work done on your house is very, very difficult because there just aren't the people. And there aren't necessarily the people with the skills. When we start looking at insulation, we start looking at energy efficiency, we start looking at those things. It's a very, very small number of people who are in a position to do any of that work and do it to a high standard.
Willie, Rennie?
We've identified all the problems this evening. I think the story that I heard from Susan is something I hear about almost every day of the week. And it really breaks my heart when I meet young people in all parts of rural Scotland who can't stay and remain in the area that they grew up. And I think that should be a fundamental right, that they should be able to keep their community together with a wide, diverse range of ages and makeups, because that's a community. And we are ripping the heart out of community by failing to deal with the problems that Susan identified. And a lot of this has to be solved by driving an investment. But just now, because the government have cut significant amount of funds from the social housing programme, we need to reverse that. But we also need to drive in private investment. So we need to see private landlords, good private landlords, as partners, because we need them to be successful, because we will not do this by social housing alone, and we won't do this by buying houses alone. We need a private rented sector that works, because not everybody can get on the social housing list. There's simply not enough. So we need a partnership to make this a success. And that's where government needs to change the approach and make sure they bring the landlords, and the good ones, to make sure we're working in partnership. Now, there's another aspect I'd like to bring in, which is the rural housing burden. The rural housing burden is where landowners can work and get security for a property to remain as a purchase property for local people. They can determine through a local housing list as to who can buy that property. So people get on the housing ladder, they can climb up that housing ladder by having an equity share held by a community trust. That's ideal for places like this. Now, it's not going to deal with all the problems, because we need to make sure the private investment comes, we need to make sure we've got control of the second homes, and I'm afraid the council tax isn't enough, For a house in my constituency in Ely where you buy for £1.7 million, they don't care if the council tax has been doubled. What they really want is control through the planning system. Then the final aspect is we don't have enough planners. It takes ages to get housing developments through the system. We are 700 planners short. 700. We should be training. We should have seen this coming, that housing has not just become a problem overnight. It's been a problem for years. And that's why we need to have all of those aspects, investment, planning, the regulation, all of that working together. Because we know what the problems are, finding the solutions an awful lot harder.
Your views on all of this and your experiences wherever you are in Scotland on this as well. The hashtag is BBCDN on social media. Let's go to our next question tonight, which a lot of people wanted to talk about in this room. And it comes from Elke Kastner. Elke, good evening.
Good evening. Hello. So, my question, our high street is dying. Last week, our cinema has shut its doors too. The next cinema is 100 miles round trip. How are you planning to support rural communities in their endeavour to keep young people in town and attract others to come to live here?
Thank you very much. Very sad to come here and see the Phoenix cinema shut. 8 staff, I think, lost their jobs as well here. Michael Shanks, huge issue, trying to keep young people in rural Scotland and give them reasons to stay. What should we be doing?
I'm tempted to say I think we've just had the conversation about what we should be doing, actually, because I think probably the root of some of it is housing, is that actually people maybe want to go off to university and then come back, but they actually can't, and people maybe don't want to live at home or don't have the possibility of doing that.
As well.
I do think, but housing's crucial in that. And then, of course, yes, you're right, economic development. And, you know, in 2024, there's probably more potential for people through IT to be working from home in different types of jobs to be able to stay here. So there's a link back to things like infrastructure around broadband provision and all of those things. But there is something about our economic model around town centres generally, where things are closing all the time, partly because transport is so poor that people end up jumping in the car and going to an out-of-town shopping centre, all these kind of things. We need to think about communities in a slightly different way and invest in them and give local authorities both the power and the funding to create some really good development plans for localities so that people can have cinemas and shops and pharmacies and doctors' surgeries and all the things that we want in our society within a reasonable distance of where we are.
Meghan Gallacher, how do we support rural communities, town centres, and give young people a reason to stay?
But yeah, well, it's a really important question, and it's one, you know, that I think should be in the focus of every single party, not even going into this general election, but should be the focus from now, but even before then, it should just have been a focus. But unfortunately, in many rural communities right across Scotland, they've been completely forgotten about. And it is about making sure the right infrastructure's in place. That's road infrastructure, making sure you've got access to a GP. I mean, I think there's about 40,000 people who are waiting on an NHS waiting list in NHS Highland. That is shocking. But it's even more difficult for someone who lives in a rural area to actually access the healthcare services that they need because there's not the right infrastructure in place.
They need jobs
but
as well.
Jobs, yes, absolutely. And it's about supporting businesses because, as we know, the business rates relief has not been passed on here in Scotland. That would have been a 75% rates relief that businesses in England are getting, but they're certainly not getting here in Scotland. So if you don't have the jobs, if you don't have the infrastructure, if you don't have the right means to keep people in rural communities, then you will see the issue that was pointed out earlier on about depopulation. But that is not good for anybody whatsoever. But Alyn, I'm just wondering, because I mean, this was an SNP policy not to pass on the 75% rates relief. Is that something that you support? Because
well, I'm glad you asked.
It should be.
The UK Exchequer decided to have 75% rates relief for some businesses for a year, and then that was passed on to Scotland. We decided to put it to the NHS, which is why we've not had strikes in Scotland's NHS.
40,000 people in NHS
we have seen
waiting
strikes
lists.
elsewhere in the UK. So I want to see businesses supported. If I might answer the question, jobs, connectivity and housing are the biggest issues facing rural Scotland, I believe. And if we get the connectivity right, there's all sorts of people could locate into rural Scotland, but then housing is going to be the problem, which is where the earlier question, we need to tackle housing.
What's stopping you getting the connectivity right in rural areas?
Well, we're making progress. I mean, there's a lot of broadband, particularly, is being upgraded, is being brought forward, and we're going to get there, and that's something that we're working on very hard. And then access to housing is something that we dealt with in the previous question. Community ownership and social enterprises are going to need to step into this gap. Because
I think the cinema was a community ownership. It was, yeah, and that's closed down.
Well, that's because we're going to need to see much more incentive to get people into our town village centres using the facilities that we've got. And the economics need to stack up better, because if you set up a social enterprise, your business rates are going to cripple you before you've done anything. And we need to alter the basis for social enterprises particularly. We need to see incentivisation that we've not got at the moment back into the high street, back into village centres.
Lots of hands have shot up in the audience, so let me hear from them. Lady with the short hair there, yes, on you go.
Thanks. Everybody's referring to the infrastructure and how specific it is to rural Scotland. Now, if we are in the gateway to the islands, and I have to say what's happened with the SNP in Calmac has almost killed the islands and the tourism and all the support that we could get, because we can't get the big things right, but they talk about the small things. We need to get the big things right.
Thank you. Lady in the purple top, towards the back, yes.
Yes. Interestingly, I think that communication is the critical thing, but when in Oban, we actually had every single road, rail cut off by bad weather because climate change is going to hit this area in a big way. We cannot afford to have our infrastructure just ignored and left where it is. Something needs to be done about it. The infrastructure for these rural areas, which have very, very few access points, has to be looked at very carefully and prioritised. And we aren't prioritised. We're left with roads where there's mudslides coming down, there's flooding, and nobody does anything about it.
I think Oban was cut off one day last year. Thank you. Lady with the glasses, along here. Yes.
I think we're talking about investing in our local communities, where Oban specifically, we are supported greatly by the third sector. We have a huge amount of incredible third sector organisations that continuously receive little to no funding from our local authority, and we constantly have to rely on our community putting money back into our organisations so we can continue to run. And it's where the gap is for that there isn't this responsibility in our local authorities or wider to help third sector organisations continue to support our communities. It's constantly just put back in our communities to make it work rather than responsibility coming from elsewhere.
Got you, thank you. And just finally, lady in the back row there, yeah.
All of these small businesses that we're talking about have to pay heating, lighting, electricity, and these bills have gone up so much in the last few years, and it's crippling a lot of these small businesses.
Guy Grieve.
So a lot of what I sometimes hear from the SNP, which I've often quite liked a lot, what the SNP say, because I quite like the idea of having government near to, you know, those who are governed, right? And a lot of what they're doing is good. I've liked it. But then I come across certain statistics that just scare me. Like, have you heard about the 450 million that they haven't spent?
Well, that's not happening.
They've given 170 million back to Europe?
No.
You've already given 170 million back to Europe?
No, we've not.
Yes, you have.
No.
Well, the other thing, too, is I've seen that you guys are going to have to pay back 28% of that money to Europe. Northern Ireland is paying back 2%. Wales is paying back 9%. And England is paying back 6%. We're paying back 28%. And you guys have said you can spend the rest of that by the end of this month? Or have I just heard wrong?
Well, thank you for bringing up EU funding. I did that for 16 years in the European Parliament. Look, it's midway through the funding process. Right. And the COVID got in the way of a lot of the budgets, of course it did. So the match funding domestically meant that the projects, a number of them, couldn't go forward the way we expected.
But Emma Forbes is saying she'll spend it by the end of this month.
The money is going to be spent.
By the end of this month?
Why on earth would we want to see that money go back? The money is going to be spent.
All of it. That's a commitment.
Cast iron, absolutely.
All of it.
Why on earth would we want to see money go back?
Okay.
The issue that we're losing that funding is because we've left the European Union. And we talk about the symptoms of austerity, but the two Westminster parties here are committed to continuing it. I want to see more money in the system for housing, for broadband, for business support, for the NHS.
450.
We're not going to put money back to
this
the
450 is going to be spent in Scotland, because I've read that a large amount of it's going to go back, and 170 million has already gone back.
Yeah, I don't recognise the 450 figure, and there's a number of questions about that article. And it is an issue, of course it is, because COVID did disrupt the budgets, of course it did.
Because other countries have managed to spend that money and we haven't.
Well, no, every EU country is having the same issue with this, to one extent or another. And as are the 4 home nations as well. This is where the EU stuff needs to be fully understood.
Are the other nations of the UK giving back the same amount of money?
We aren't going to get that money spent.
Okay.
Full stop.
But I think
we're going to get that money spent. Why on earth would we want to see it go?
But I think people here at home will want to know, will that money be spent on them to make their lives better? It's about people's priorities here.
It's going to be spent on the projects it's been allocated to, which is about job creation, infrastructure, precisely the investment we need. We're against austerity in the SNP. We're not going to give money back when we can spend it on the people's priorities.
OK, well, I think you've cleared that up here this evening, and I'm sure people here are hoping that some of that money will come in this direction. Man on the aisle here, yes.
Alyn's talking about spending money in Scotland for the people of Scotland. But we're also talking about our local cinema closing. We've also got issues here in town with, I think, the Rockfield Centre. Yeah. Why are the SNP cutting Creative Scotland budgets?
Look, we can argue about the consequences of austerity, or we can try and fix the problem. Now, Willie talks about we can't have the argument of Brexit. Well, actually, I'm interested in solving the problem. We've taken a £140 billion hit from leaving the EU. We've taken a several £billion extra hit from Liz Truss's mini-budget, but that's just dismissed as a bagatelle. The consequences of austerity are being seen in every community across the whole of Scotland, and the UK if it comes to it, which is where we need to change the game. We need to get back into the EU. We need to put the resources of Scotland for the betterment of the people of Scotland.
The problem with austerity here from Alyn is that what the SNP did was they took the austerity from the Conservative budgets, passed it on to local government with an even greater cut than the central government has. And so we see all across Scotland, local government budgets have been slashed for more than a decade now. And in the early years, maybe councils were able to find things that people did rely on, but that they were able to cut. But now we're right down to the bone and there's nothing left to cut, which is why libraries are on the chopping block.
Well, Rishi Sunak last night in the TV debate was saying Labour are going to continue Conservative austerity.
And Rishi Sunak lied about a number of things on the television last night, and lied isn't a word that I would ever normally use in politics, but he blatantly lied more than a dozen times on television last night.
But Michael, but the £18 billion, the £18 billion that the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said, now that's not Rishi Sunak, I agree with you on that. But Labour is committed to an austerity agenda.
No, we're not.
Now, that's going to cause all the problems across all of our communities that we're seeing now.
Keir Starmer was very clear last night. He said very, very clearly that austerity will not return. And we've set out exactly how we will avoid it through a number of tax rises on specific
but the
things
largest
like
one is Brexit, and you haven't touched on
Brexit.
Brexit.
None of this is saving the Phoenix Cinema and the 8 workers who lost their jobs there. Back to the question, what do we do about rural communities, places like Oban where we are tonight, where things are closing and there are less and less reasons for young people to stay here? Willie, Rennie.
And that is the challenge that's been faced by many communities across Scotland. The facilities are closing. If you go to town centres, almost in every community, the heart has been ripped out of them. And it's part through the decision that we're all making as individual consumers when we buy stuff off Amazon and when we choose to go for Netflix rather than going to the cinema. So we have to hold some of the responsibility ourselves for the way that our town centres are declining. But there is also a huge responsibility on government to plan better. So, for instance, we cannot go back to the shopping centres that we had in the past. We need to change the way that they work. So we need to more people, this partly goes back to the housing issue, we need to get more people living in town centres above the shops. It makes it safer. There's more people around. You get more cafes and shops in those that serve those people. Then the cinema will work because it's a safer place to go. But then we have to tackle the wider problem of housing that we discussed earlier on and creating the jobs and the opportunities. But the biggest challenge of all is that government doesn't do the basics like I've described like that because it's boring. They never sort these things out. They always have endless consultations and working groups that last for years and never amount to anything. We need to do the detailed stuff to make this work. Instead, they spend triple the budget on building ferries that still aren't here yet. Those are the mistakes that the government make because they don't focus on getting the basics right to make our country run.
Okay,
and if we can do that, we've got a better chance of keeping the cinema open
in Oban. Up in the audience here. I want to hear from them. Gentleman in the blue shirt. Yes, on you go.
If we want to fill up our high street with shops, we have to make it attractive for young people to want to start businesses in our high street. At the moment, I run a high street shop, and I cannot fight the internet. From our West Country, our Highland location, we just cannot fight the internet. And we need to make it attractive for young people to want to start businesses. So there has to be some sort of way to level up competition from the internet for those of us who can't compete at all because of our location.
And what would you see that being?
Well, there has been talk for previous years about some sort of levy on internet sales against in-shop sales, and that could level the playing field and make it more attractive for young people to start businesses and fill the spaces in our high street.
Thank you. Man on the front row.
One thing that was telling in the discussion there, and it does come down to the infrastructure of Oban there, was this issue of not passing on business rates relief here. And what struck me was that the immediate response was the apparently altruistic position of the SNP of saying, well, we gave it to the NHS so that we're not getting strikes like they are south of the border. Some of those public sector pay rises that they were asking for were unfeasible and unrealistic in the time. To use that as a nice wee gesture to again point out the difference between Scotland and England, pretend it's different. Wonderful to do that for the NHS. Other public sector workers did not get those pay rises because they didn't have the power to strike, for example. I'm a wee bit disturbed that we're casually dismissing business rates relief for political grandstanding, when the difference it would make in a community like this would be huge.
OK, all right. So, we need to move on, Guy, because there's another very important subject we want to get to tonight. It's a lot to get through. Your views on that and everything else you hear on the programme, the hashtag is BBCDN, and how you are being affected in your local communities by some of these issues. Our third question tonight comes from Isabel Grau. Isabel, evening.
Will the next Westminster government look at immigration policy to reflect the needs of Scotland's labour market?
Thank you. Immigration, an issue in this general election, a hot issue. Record net migration to the UK last year, extra 685,000 people. But Scotland faces a population problem. We're going to peak population 2028, and it falls after that. Meghan Gallacher, the Conservatives have announced today as part of the general election campaign a visa cap. How's that going to help Scotland's labour shortages?
So I think we need to look at immigration in a pragmatic way. We have got record levels, as you have rightly pointed out, but the issue is that we are not having immigration here in Scotland. So we do have people coming over to the United Kingdom, but they're then not coming to Scotland. And the question I have is, why are they not coming to Scotland? And I think that it's going back to what we've discussed thus far. It's because we don't have the right infrastructure, transport networks. We have, really high NHS waiting lists. We don't have, a great school standard at present.
Do you think that's feeding into the decisions that people make when they move to the UK?
I do think it is feeding into the decisions that people make, because we do need to ask the question, why are people not coming to Scotland? And I think that's when devolution really comes into play. It's about the SNP not focusing on priorities that are important here, but also making Scotland a really attractive place for people to come, live, work, but also stay.
Alyn Smith.
That's the fundamental problem.
Yeah, Scotland does have a problem with immigration. We don't have enough. We need more people in Scotland, not fewer. And Meghan talks about the Tories' policy, which is just flatly incredible, and I have to say morally reprehensible to me. I think some of the most vulnerable people in the world are being used as playthings by an administration that is dreadful.
Alan, answer her point. Why aren't people coming here?
Well, we proposed a post-work study visa for students that came to Scotland to work in Scotland thereafter. The Tories didn't let it happen, because immigration policy is reserved to Westminster at the moment, which is why I want to see Scotland have power over immigration, because there's a cross-party consensus across most of the parties that we need more people, not fewer. We've got chronic labour shortages across rural Scotland. We've got skills shortages across all of Scotland. And if you want to get particular things like joinery or work done, as the gentleman said earlier, you're waiting a long time because we don't have enough people to do it.
So again,
we need
why
more
aren't
people.
those workers coming to Scotland?
Well, that's where I would agree with some of what Meghan was saying in terms of the access to housing, access to skills. We need to pay people more money, which is why we need to stop austerity and get more money into the whole of the system so that we stop dealing with the consequences of austerity and actually deal with the causes. Now, getting back into the EU will put rocket boosters on all of our businesses. Getting back into the EU will give us freedom of movement in and out for our young people to go and experience the EU, for EU nationals to come here and make Scotland their home. that's a fantastic boost that would be great for us as a society and as an economy. Scotland's tragedy for 200 years was that we exported our people. And it warms my heart that so many people have chosen to make Scotland their home. And if you're here, you're one of us. Scotland needs more people, not fewer. And it grieves me that both the Westminster parties have adopted this anti-immigration agenda, which is so dangerous. And I don't want to see Scotland's immigration policy set by Nigel Farage or fear of Nigel Farage. And that's what we're seeing from both the Westminster parties.
Let me hear from some people in the audience. Lady in the blue top.
That people are choosing not to come to Scotland, that's not the case. I think it's, as you said, historically we always had people coming here, especially as part of the seasonal workforce. The minute we were taken out of the EU, we could no longer rely on those people to come to Scotland. We couldn't get them working in our NHS, we couldn't get them working in our hospitality because it's too hard for them to come here. It's not that they don't want to come here. They do want to come here, they just can't.
Thank you. And gentleman with the beard and the glasses towards the back. Yes.
Rishi Sunak has, in fact, actually whipped up fear by concentrating on the rubber boats and the immigration across the Channel. In reality, the, whatever it is, 40,000 that have come in that way, in fact, is a small fraction of the total net migration, which is running at somewhere around about 600,000. So, in fact, we've got this problem, in fact, of people, in fact, now unable to come as a function of the limits put on the number of visas, which, in fact, we're going to actually allow in, if, in fact, of course, the Conservatives get their way.
Thank you. Michael Shanks, listening to this, should a forthcoming, if it happens, Labour government give powers over immigration to Scotland, to Holyrood?
Well, what we've said is if we have the privilege of forming a government, we want to look at an immigration system that works for all parts of the United Kingdom. That's not just Scotland, it's actually regions within England as well that have different immigration needs. We don't think devolving the power is the right approach because what we end up having is in one system where we don't have internal borders. You actually do need some sense of a UK-wide system. Otherwise, what we'd end up having to do is have borders every time you cross from one country to another, which none of us want to see.
But you could have identity cards, you could have some system of...
What we've said is, and in the past, indeed, the Labour and Liberal Democrat coalition in Scotland had a fresh talent scheme a while back, which was an idea of saying once you'd got a qualification in Scotland, you could stay on in Scotland longer because we knew we wanted to keep people in Scotland. So there are approaches we're very happy to look at and suggestions that we're keen to take a look at about where we spread this issue so the immigration system works for everyone in the UK. There are particular economic issues in Scotland, but I think we can't detach the issues that we've just been talking around housing in particular, around pay, for why people are not doing those jobs in Scotland itself. For example, the number of engineering visas that have been issued in the past year has doubled, and the number of engineering apprenticeships has halved. Now, that's a very clear thing that what we should be doing is encouraging people and funding these apprenticeships in the UK so that young people have those opportunities and not just looking at immigration as a means to fill those. Now, where I really disagree with Alyn is Alyn and I have been in the same voting lobby for quite a lot of this year on the Tories' Rwanda bill. The idea that we're in the same place on immigration as the Conservatives is just not true. Well, the Rwanda bill, as the gentleman said at the back, it will fix a tiny part of this issue.
Nigel Farage
has
said
the issue at all.
He's suggesting that we should have net zero immigration because that would encourage people here to get back into work, economically inactive people here.
I'm not going to give any credit to...
That's another problem about us not speaking about Brexit. If we were having a really mature, open debate about how damaging Brexit has been, Nigel Farage would have been dragged over the coals, every one of his lies revealed, and he wouldn't even exist politically now. It's because we have failed to raise Brexit that we've allowed these charlatans to continue to have some kind of veracity and existence.
But we do have record numbers of net migration to the UK after Brexit, post-Brexit.
I think, look, you've got to view migration as a river of humanity, which you've got to look at, and there's so much good in it, and there's a lot that you've got to be very disciplined about and make sure that it doesn't bring harm to this country. It needs to be approached, I think, in a really strong way that values the fact that, you know, that to a large extent, many migrants who come here come from cultures which have a great respect for age, And there's a tremendous advantages that can be brought to us through the caring system. We're an aging population. To a large extent, many migrants are quite young. There's youth there, there's vigor, there's ambition. There is so much good that we've got to go for. But people like Farage, he really should have been revealed a very long time ago to be a very, I think, quite a fraudulent populist and an extremely good actor. But beyond that...
Well, now standing to become an MP, Willie Rennie.
So I find the anti-immigration debate both morally reprehensible, but also economically illiterate.
Here, here.
Now, if you look at some of the people that are coming across in the boats are the most vulnerable people in the world. They've taken their families from their homes, war-torn homes, across in the hands of gangs, on rubber boats, where many of them lose their lives.
So what control should
there be? Let me just finish this. This is really important that we understand these are humans.
Well, we know that.
No. The debate too often dehumanises these people. We need to understand it could be my son, it could be your son, it could be your daughter that could be going across the seas, and we treat them like numbers. These are people that deserve respect. That's why we need to discuss these people.
Yeah.
But there's also something inspirational about these people. That these people are incredibly talented. They've got great engineering. If you're going to take your family from one side of the world to the other, there's a bit of go about you, isn't there? These are the people we should be wanting to have in our country.
So why are they not coming to Scotland at the moment? That's Meghan Gallagher's point.
Yeah, I know, but it's very small beer, isn't it? I mean, for goodness sake, we need to look at the big picture. Of course the SNP are terrible. Of course they've got terrible public services. Of course that's the reason. But the big picture here is how do we get the right people into our country to drive our economy? Because, let's say, for instance, the students we can get in our universities, they are some of the best in the world. They can drive the ingenuity of our universities. The people who pick berries on the fruit farms, they can come from all over the world to do that. It's some of the best produce, food and drink produce that we've got in this country. These people are a great talent, economically beneficial, but morally such a powerful case. So let's make the case, the positive case for immigration, and let's get rid of the fear
Let me just wrap this up with the lady with the glasses there. Yes.
I was born in France. I grew up in France. I came to the UK for university, and no real other reason. I have stayed, I have moved to Scotland, and I run a business here with my partner which brings people into town and supports the local economy. I'm lucky. My parents are English, and that means I'm allowed to do it. Others are not.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks to all of you for being with us this evening. That's it for this evening's programme. We are back with you on Tuesday. Before that, though, you can watch the programme again a little bit later this evening if you want to, and it's going to be on BBC One Scotland a little bit later as well. Next Tuesday is our Leaders Special, which is from Glasgow. It's live at 8 o'clock. If you'd like to be in the audience for that, the address is on your screen right now. And make sure you join us for that. Thank you very much indeed to my panel here tonight and to our audience in Oban, our first time with you. It's been lovely to be with you this evening. And to you at home for watching. We'll see you next Tuesday live from Glasgow with the Scottish Leaders Special. Until then, stay safe, stay well from all of us in Debate Night. Good night.